The glass doors of the Golden Terrace restaurant swung open as Richard stepped inside, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. He adjusted his silk tie and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. This was his favorite spot in the city. The place where deals were made, where power players gathered, and where everyone knew his name. Richard had worked his way up to regional operations manager at Silverstone Corporation, and he made sure everyone knew it. His designer suits cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he wore his success like a crown. At 42, he had mastered the art of looking important even when he wasn't actually doing much. The hostess smiled at him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson. Your usual table?" "Of course, Diana. Is it ready?" he asked, barely glancing at her. "Just a few minutes, sir. We're just finishing setting it up." Richard nodded and pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails he had no intention of answering. His assistant would handle them anyway. That's what assistants were for, right? As he stood there, someone bumped into him from behind. He stumbled forward slightly, nearly dropping his phone. Annoyed, he spun around, ready to give whoever it was a piece of his mind. A woman stood there, looking flustered and apologetic. She was probably in her late 30s, wearing a simple, flower print dress that looked like it came from a department store clearance rack. Her shoes were flat and worn at the edges, and she carried a canvas tote bag that had definitely seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a basic ponytail, and she held an old model phone in her hand, the kind with a cracked screen that people kept meaning to replace, but never did. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly, her voice soft. "I wasn't watching where I was going." Richard looked her up and down, his lip curling slightly. He took a step back, as if putting distance between himself and someone so clearly out of place. "Obviously," he said coldly. Then he looked past her toward the entrance. "Are you lost? The bus stop is 2 blocks that way." The woman blinked, confusion crossing her face. "Excuse me?" Richard sighed dramatically, like he was explaining something to a child. "Listen, I don't know who told you about this place, but this isn't exactly a restaurant for everyone. The prices here could probably cover your groceries for a month. There's a nice little diner down the street. Much more in your price range, if you know what I mean." A few other people in the waiting area had turned to watch. Some looked uncomfortable, others pretended not to notice, suddenly very interested in their phones. The woman's expression remained calm, though something flickered in her eyes. "I have a reservation," she said simply. Richard actually laughed out loud at that. "A reservation? Here?" He shook his head, still chuckling. "Let me guess. You're somebody's assistant here to pick up a takeout order for your boss? That makes more sense." He gestured toward the side of the restaurant. "The takeout pickup is around the corner, service entrance. You don't need to come through the main doors." Diana, the hostess, had been watching this exchange with growing discomfort. She knew she should say something, but Richard was one of their biggest spenders. He brought clients here 3 times a week, ran up bills in the thousands, and tipped well when he was in a good mood. Crossing him could mean trouble. The woman in the simple dress reached into her tote bag and pulled out her phone. She tapped the screen a few times, then held it out to Diana. "I believe you'll find my reservation under Mitchell. 2 o'clock. Diana looked at the phone, then down at her tablet. Her eyes widened slightly. She glanced up at the woman, then back at her screen. Oh, yes, Ms. Mitchell. I apologize for the wait." "Right this way, please." Richard's smile faded. "Wait, what? Diana, what table are you giving her?" Diana avoided his eyes. "Table 12, Mr. Thompson." "Table 12? That's one of the best tables in the house. That's where you seat executives and VIPs. Richard's voice had risen enough that several diners inside the restaurant turned to look. The woman named Mitchell picked up her tote bag and adjusted it on her shoulder. She looked at Richard directly for the first time, her gaze steady and calm. "Have a nice lunch, sir," she said quietly, then followed Diana into the dining room. Richard stood there, his face red, feeling foolish and angry. Who did she think she was? How did someone dressed like that get a prime table at the Golden Terrace? Maybe she was related to the owner or something. Rich people sometimes dressed down, he supposed, though he never understood why anyone would do that. He pushed the encounter out of his mind. He had more important things to think about. Today he was meeting with his team to celebrate another successful quarter. Well, successful for him anyway. The numbers looked good, and that's what mattered. Sure, his assistant Linda did most of the actual work, and his team leads came up with most of the ideas. But he was the one who presented everything to upper management. He was the face of the department. That's what leadership was all about. 20 minutes later, Richard was seated at his usual table with 3 of his favorite team members. Well, favorite might be a strong word. They were the ones who laughed at his jokes and didn't ask too many questions. "Did you guys hear?" Richard said, cutting into his steak. "The company hired a new chief operating officer, starts next week." Kevin, one of his supervisors, raised his eyebrows. "Really? From inside the company?" "Nope, outside hire." Richard shook his head. "Can you believe it? Some outsider coming in to tell us how to do our jobs. Probably some corporate fossil who doesn't understand how things actually work." "Do we know anything about them?" asked Mike, another supervisor. "Does it matter?" Richard took a sip of his wine. "These types are all the same. They come in, make a bunch of noise about changes and improvements. Maybe shuffle some people around to make it look like they're doing something. Then leave after a year or two when they realize they're in over their heads." The men at the table laughed, but it was the uncomfortable laughter of people who weren't quite sure if they should be laughing. "I give the new COO 3 months before they figure out this place runs fine without their interference," Richard continued. "We've got our system. It works. The numbers are good. Why fix what isn't broken?" Across the restaurant at table 12, the woman in the simple dress sat alone. She had ordered a simple soup and salad, and while she ate, she made notes in a small notebook. Occasionally, she would glance around the restaurant, observing, watching, taking it all in. If Richard had paid more attention, he might have noticed her. He might have wondered what she was writing. He might have been curious about why someone who could afford table 12 chose to dress so simply. But Richard wasn't in the habit of paying attention to people he considered beneath him, and that, as he would soon discover, was a very expensive mistake. The woman finished her meal, paid her bill in cash, and left a generous tip. She smiled at Diana on her way out. "Thank you for the excellent service," she said warmly. "I'll be back soon." Diana watched her leave, then glanced over at Richard's table where loud laughter had just erupted. She had a strange feeling, like she had just witnessed something important, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what. The afternoon sun filtered through the restaurant windows as lunch service continued. Richard finished his meal, complained about the new management being too expensive, even though the company was paying, and left his usual modest tip. He'd walked out feeling satisfied, successful, and completely unaware that his entire world was about to be turned upside down. Back at the Silverstone Corporation office, Linda sat at her desk answering Richard's emails, fixing his scheduling conflicts and preparing the presentation he would give tomorrow morning. The presentation she had actually created, researched, and written. The presentation that had her ideas but would have his name on every slide. She stayed until 7 that evening, making sure everything was perfect. Richard would glance at it for 5 minutes tomorrow morning, maybe change a word or two, then present it as if he'd worked on it for weeks. This was just how things worked. This was normal. But normal was about to change. In a quiet apartment across town, the woman from the restaurant sat at her dining table, her notebook open. She had spent the last week observing Silverstone Corporation. From the inside, dressed simply, speaking quietly and watching everything, she had seen enough. Tomorrow, she would begin her real work. Tomorrow, people like Richard would discover that underestimating someone based on their appearance was the first step toward losing everything they had built on false foundations. She closed her notebook and smiled slightly. It wasn't a smile of revenge or satisfaction. It was the smile of someone who knew that justice, real justice, was worth the wait. The following Monday morning started like any other at Silverstone Corporation. Richard arrived at 9:30, a full hour after most of his team, carrying his usual overpriced coffee and wearing his smuggest smile. He had spent the weekend at a golf resort, posting photos on social media of himself with other executives, making sure everyone knew he was well connected. Linda was already at her desk as she had been since 8 o'clock. She looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes that her makeup couldn't quite hide. "Linda, did you finish those reports I asked for?" Richard asked, not bothering with a good morning. "Yes, they're on your desk. I also fixed the errors in the Johnson proposal and updated the quarterly projections." Great, Richard said, barely listening. He walked into his office and closed the door. Through the glass walls, Linda could see him immediately pick up his phone and start scrolling through social media. The report she'd spent 5 hours preparing yesterday sat untouched on his desk. Down the hall in a small conference room, the woman from the restaurant sat quietly in the corner. She wore simple gray slacks and a plain white blouse. Her hair was pulled back again and she carried the same worn tote bag. A few people had noticed her throughout the morning, but no one paid much attention. The company had sent an email last week announcing that a corporate observer would be sitting in on various meetings and operations. These observers came through every few years, usually from headquarters, asking questions and taking notes. Most employees had learned to just ignore them and go about their business. What they didn't know was that this observer was actually their new chief operating officer, doing exactly what she always did when starting a new position. She believed you couldn't fix what you didn't understand, and you couldn't understand by sitting in a corner office reading reports. You had to see how people actually worked, how they really treated each other when they thought no one important was watching. She spent the morning observing department meetings. She watched how Richard spoke to his team, how he interrupted people mid-sentence, particularly the women, how he dismissed ideas without consideration, then presented the same ideas later as if they were his own, how he checked his phone constantly while others presented their work, but demanded complete attention when he spoke. During a 10 o'clock team meeting, something particularly telling happened. A young analyst named Tom presented a new efficiency model he'd been developing. It was innovative, well-researched, and could potentially save the company significant money. Richard barely looked up from his phone during the presentation. When Tom finished, Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Yeah, interesting, but not practical. We don't have time for experimental approaches. Stick to what works." Tom's face fell. He had spent 3 weeks on this project. The observer made a note in her notebook. 2 hours later, Richard was in a meeting with upper management from a different division. The observer sat in on this meeting too, as she had been sitting in on dozens of meetings throughout the company. "I've been working on something exciting," Richard announced, pulling up a presentation, a new efficiency model that could revolutionize how we handle operations. The observer leaned forward slightly. On the screen was Tom's presentation, with minor changes and Richard's name on every slide. She wrote for a long time in her notebook after that. At lunch, the observer sat in the cafeteria, eating a simple sandwich she had brought from home. She sat alone, but she watched and listened. Employees around her talked freely, not realizing the simply dressed woman in the corner was anyone important. "Did you see Richard took credit for Tom's work again?" one person whispered to another. "Again? That's like the 5th time this quarter." "I know. Remember when Ashley came up with the vendor management system? Richard presented it to the board and got a bonus. Ashley got nothing. Why doesn't anyone say anything? Are you kidding?" The last person who complained about Richard got transferred to the night shift in the warehouse. Then they quit. Richard has friends in high places. He's untouchable. The observer took another bite of her sandwich and continued listening. That afternoon, Linda was working on yet another project Richard had dumped on her desk. It was almost 5 o'clock, and most people were getting ready to leave. Richard had left at 3 for a client meeting that everyone knew was actually a golf game. The observer approached Linda's desk. Linda looked up, startled. She had seen this woman around but hadn't really thought much about it. "You're here late," the woman said gently. Linda forced a smile. "Just finishing up some things. Monday always seems to pile up, you know." "I do know." The woman glanced at the work spread across Linda's desk. "That looks like the Henderson analysis. Complex stuff. Yeah, my boss needs it for a presentation tomorrow morning. He's very particular about how things need to be formatted." "How long have you worked here?" Linda paused, wondering why this observer was making small talk. But she seemed kind and Linda was so tired. 5 years next month. That's a long time. Do you enjoy it?" The question hung in the air. Linda opened her mouth to give the automatic answer, the one she always gave. Yes, of course, I'm very lucky to have this position. But something about the way this woman asked, the genuine interest in her eyes, made Linda hesitate. Can I be honest? Linda asked quietly. Please. I used to love it. I came here right out of college full of ideas and energy. I thought if I worked hard and proved myself, I'd get opportunities to grow. And the work itself is interesting. I'm good at what I do, but, the woman prompted gently. Linda glanced around to make sure no one was listening. But I feel invisible. I do the work, but my boss takes the credit. I stay late, I fix problems, I come up with solutions, and none of it matters. Every time I think about leaving, I wonder if it's the same everywhere. At least here I know what to expect, you know? The woman nodded slowly. She didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. What would you do differently if you could? The question surprised Linda. No one had ever asked her that. I'd want people to feel valued. I'd want a place where good work got recognized regardless of who did it. Where you didn't have to be loud or play politics to be seen. Where staying late to help the team meant something. That sounds like a good workplace, the woman said. Sounds like a fantasy, Linda replied, then immediately looked worried. Like she'd said too much to a corporate observer, but the woman just smiled softly. Maybe. Or maybe it's just waiting for the right people to build it. She stood up to leave. Don't stay too late. That work will still be there tomorrow. As she walked away, Linda felt something strange, a tiny flicker of something that felt almost like hope. She shook her head and went back to her work. Hope was dangerous. Better to keep your head down and just survive. Over the next few days, the observer continued her quiet rounds through the company. She sat in on budget meetings where Richard inflated his department's needs while cutting resources for others. She watched him schmooze with senior managers over expensive lunches, then returned to berate his team for minor issues. She also saw the good things. She saw Tom staying late to help a coworker understand a complex system. She saw Linda covering for team members who had family emergencies. She saw the potential in people who had been pushed down for so long they'd forgotten they could stand up. On Thursday morning, Richard was in particularly fine form. He had just learned about a major account his division had won, though the actual work had been done entirely by his team over the past 3 months. See, this is what I'm talking about, he announced loudly in the break room where several employees were getting coffee. This is why I push you people so hard. Results. This account is worth millions, and it happened because of strong leadership. A few people nodded. Most just stared at their coffee. Now I expect everyone to step up their game even more. We can't rest on our success. I need reports from everyone by tomorrow morning on what you're going to do to replicate this success. After he left, the break room was quiet. Then someone spoke up. Is he serious? That account was mostly Tom and Linda's work. Mostly? It was entirely their work, someone else said. Richard barely even knew the client's name until the contract was signed. Welcome to Silverstone, an older employee muttered. Same as it ever was, but things weren't going to stay the same. Not anymore. Friday afternoon, everyone received an email. All operations staff were required to attend a mandatory meeting Monday morning at 10. No exceptions. The email came from the CEO's office, which meant it was serious. The office buzzed with speculation. Mandatory meetings usually meant reorganization, layoffs, or some new policy no one would like. Richard, however, seemed unconcerned. He figured it was probably some announcement about the new COO. Maybe a boring introduction and some corporate speeches about synergy and teamwork. He spent Friday afternoon on personal calls and left at 3, reminding Linda to have those reports ready for Monday. Linda stayed until 7 as usual. The observer, the simply dressed woman who had spent 2 weeks watching everything, packed up her notebook. She had seen enough. She had all the information she needed. Monday would be very interesting indeed. That weekend, Richard posted more photos from another golf outing. Linda spent Saturday catching up on laundry and trying not to think about work. Tom updated his resume just in case. None of them knew that by Monday afternoon everything would be different. Sunday night, Richard laid out his most expensive suit. New COO or not, he wanted to look impressive. He had heard through the grapevine that the new boss was some woman with a fancy background, probably all theory and no practical experience. He'd dealt with types like that before. Give them 6 months and they usually left when they realized how things really worked. He went to bed confident, comfortable, completely unaware that in less than 12 hours, the simply dressed woman he'd mocked in a restaurant would be standing at the front of that conference room, holding his entire career in her hands. Monday morning arrived with nervous energy filling the Silverstone Corporation offices. By 9:30, the conference room was packed with every member of the operations department. People stood along the walls when the chairs ran out. Everyone was there except one person. Richard was late, as usual. He had stopped for his expensive coffee, taken a phone call in the parking lot about his upcoming vacation plans, and generally moved at the pace of someone who believed the world would wait for him. Because it always had. At exactly 10 o'clock, the CEO walked into the conference room. Gregory Harrison was a serious man in his 60s, respected throughout the company. Next to him walked a woman in a navy blue suit, her hair professionally styled, carrying a leather portfolio. She looked polished, confident, and completely different from the simply dressed observer who had been quietly moving through their offices for 2 weeks. Most of the people in the room didn't make the connection, but Linda did. She sat very still, her eyes widening slightly as recognition dawned. The woman who had asked her those questions. The observer in the corner. That was her? The CEO began speaking. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here on time. The emphasis on time made several people glance at Richard's empty chair. Before we begin, I want to address something important, Gregory continued. Some of you may have noticed a corporate observer in your meetings over the past 2 weeks. I want to be clear. That was not a standard observation. That was Dr. Elizabeth Mitchell, and she was conducting her own assessment of our operations before officially beginning her role. A murmur rippled through the room. Several people exchanged confused looks. Beginning today, Dr. Mitchell is Silverstone Corporation's new Chief Operating Officer. She comes to us with an impressive background. She transformed operations at 3 Fortune 500 companies, specializing in rebuilding departments and creating sustainable, efficient, and ethical workplace cultures. She has my complete support and authority. I'll let her introduce herself properly. Elizabeth stepped forward. As she did, the conference room doors opened. Richard rushed in, his coffee in one hand, phone in the other, clearly finishing up a conversation that had nothing to do with work. Sorry, he said loudly, not looking sorry at all. Traffic was terrible. He started to head for a seat in the back, then stopped. His eyes landed on Elizabeth. His face went completely white. She held his gaze for a long moment, then looked back at the room. Please, find a seat. We have a lot to cover. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he found the nearest empty chair. Around him, people were starting to notice his reaction. A few whispered to each other. Most just watched, confused. Elizabeth's voice was calm and professional. As Gregory mentioned, I've spent the past 2 weeks observing how things actually work here, not how they look on paper. I'm a firm believer that you can't fix what you don't understand. So I watched. I listened. I learned. She clicked a remote and a presentation appeared on the screen behind her. Let me share what I found. The first slide showed employee satisfaction scores. They were terrible. Silverstone's operations division ranked in the bottom 15% of similar companies. These numbers tell a story, Elizabeth said. A story of talented people who feel undervalued. Of good work that goes unrecognized. Of a culture where fear and politics matter more than performance. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Several other managers did too. But numbers only tell part of the story. Over the past 2 weeks, I've seen specific patterns that need to change immediately. She clicked to the next slide. First, credit attribution. I watched people present ideas in team meetings, only to see those same ideas presented by their managers to senior leadership, with no mention of the original source. This isn't management. This is theft. The room was completely silent now. Linda felt her heart pounding. Second, work distribution and work-life balance. I observed some employees consistently working 10 to 12-hour days, while their direct supervisors left after 5 or 6 hours. When I reviewed actual output, I found those same employees doing the substantive work while management took credit for results. More uncomfortable shifting from several managers. Third, toxic management practices. I witnessed public humiliation, dismissed ideas without consideration, and a clear pattern of talented employees being held back rather than developed. Elizabeth paused, letting that sink in. These practices end today. Effective immediately, we're implementing several changes. She clicked through the next slides as she spoke. First, a full 360-degree review system. Everyone will receive feedback from peers, subordinates, and supervisors. And yes, that means your team members will evaluate you as managers. Richard's face went from white to red. He knew exactly what his team would say if they could do so anonymously. Second, we're establishing clear standards for credit and attribution. All projects will document contributors. Presentations to senior leadership must acknowledge source material and team members. Taking credit for others' work will be grounds for termination. She let that word hang in the air. Termination. Third, we're conducting a comprehensive audit of the past 2 years of major projects and presentations. We'll be interviewing team members about who actually did the work versus who received recognition. Linda's eyes were wide. Around the room, other employees were having similar reactions. Some looked hopeful. Some looked scared. The managers who had been playing the same game as Richard looked terrified. Finally, my doors open. Starting today, anyone who has information about projects where credit was misattributed, or who has experienced retaliation for speaking up, can come to me directly. All conversations will be confidential. No one will face retaliation for telling the truth. That's my personal guarantee. Gregory stepped forward again. To be clear, Dr. Mitchell has my full authority to make whatever changes are necessary. If that means restructuring departments, replacing management, or conducting investigations, she has the complete support of the board of directors. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes. Elizabeth outlined her vision for the department, talked about transparency and accountability, and made it clear this wasn't just talk. She had already started scheduling one-on-one meetings with every employee, starting with the longest-serving team members. When the meeting finally ended, Richard tried to slip out quickly. He made it about 3 steps before Elizabeth's voice stopped him. "Mr. Thompson, a moment, please." Everyone still in the room turned to watch. Richard's colleagues, the people who had laughed at his jokes and benefited from his protection, suddenly found reasons to be somewhere else very quickly. Richard turned slowly. "Dr. Mitchell, about the restaurant I can explain." Elizabeth held up a hand. "My office now." The walk down the hallway felt like the longest walk of Richard's life. Employees stepped aside as they passed. Word was already spreading. The new COO had been the observer. She had seen everything. And Richard Thompson, the untouchable manager who had ruled through fear for 8 years, was about to face consequences. In Elizabeth's temporary office, she gestured to a chair. Richard sat. For once in his life, he had nothing to say. Elizabeth opened a folder on her desk. "I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Thompson. I've reviewed your record. In the past 2 weeks, I've watched how you work. I've interviewed your team members. I've examined projects you claimed credit for. And I've documented everything." She pulled out several papers. The logistics optimization that saved the company $2 million. That was Linda Reeves's design. The vendor management system you presented to the board. That was Tom Chen's work. The efficiency report that won you the Regional Excellence Award. That was written by Ashley Santos, who no longer works here. Should I continue? Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. In addition, I've found 12 formal complaints filed against you in HR over the past 3 years. All of them were withdrawn after the complainants reported feeling pressured or feared for their jobs. I've also documented numerous instances of public humiliation, deliberate undermining of team members, and creation of a hostile work environment. I've been with this company for 8 years, Richard said, his voice cracking slightly. I have relationships with senior leadership. You can't just had relationships, Elizabeth corrected. With the previous CEO who retired, Gregory Harrison brought me in specifically because the board was concerned about high turnover, low morale, and talented people leaving because of toxic management. Your name came up frequently in those discussions. Richard's last bit of confidence crumbled. What happens now? Right now you're on immediate administrative leave while we complete a formal investigation. You'll have the opportunity to respond to specific allegations, but I'm going to be honest with you. The evidence is overwhelming. When the investigation concludes, you'll have 2 options. You can resign with a severance package and a neutral reference, or we can terminate you for cause, which means no severance and a record that will follow you. I suggest you use the time during your leave to consider which option serves you better. This is because of one incident, Richard said desperately. One bad moment in a restaurant. No, Elizabeth interrupted firmly. The restaurant incident revealed your character. How you treat people, you perceive. Yes, beneath you. It made me look more closely at everything else. What I found was years of abuse, theft of credit, and people suffering in silence because they believed you were untouchable. You made that culture. You maintained it, and now you face the consequences. There was a knock at the door. Security stood in the hallway. Mr. Thompson, you'll need to collect your personal items from your office. Security will escort you. Your company access has been suspended pending the investigation. Someone from HR will contact you this week to discuss next steps. Richard stood slowly. He wanted to argue, to threaten, to do something, but there was nothing left to say. He had spent years building a castle on sand, and the tide had finally come in. As security let him out, employees watched from their desks. Some looked shocked, others looked satisfied. Linda watched him pass and felt something she hadn't felt in 5 years. She felt hope. An hour later, Elizabeth called Linda into her office. "Please sit," Elizabeth said warmly. "First, I want to apologize. I know these past 2 weeks must have been confusing, seeing me observe everything without knowing who I was." Linda shook her head. "No, I understand. You needed to see how things really worked. I did. And what I saw was someone with exceptional talent being systematically held back. Your work on the Henderson account was brilliant. Your efficiency models are better than anything I've seen at companies twice this size. You should be leading projects, not just supporting someone else's career." Linda felt tears prick her eyes. She couldn't remember the last time someone had acknowledged her work. "I'm promoting you to interim operations manager, effective immediately," Elizabeth said. "It comes with a significant raise and your own team. You'll report directly to me during the transition period. If you perform as I expect, and I believe you will, we'll make it permanent in 3 months." "I don't know what to say," Linda whispered. "Say you'll help me rebuild this department the right way. Say you'll help me create a place where people like you get recognized for what you actually do." Linda took a deep breath. "I will, I promise. Good, because this is just the beginning. We have a lot of work to do." The days following Richard's departure moved quickly. Word spread through Silverstone Corporation like wildfire. The untouchable manager was gone. The new COO wasn't just making empty promises. She was actually taking action, but not everyone was celebrating. In corners of the office, in hushed conversations over lunch, some of Richard's allies were worried. Very worried. Daniel Harper, a senior manager in logistics, had built his own little empire using Richard's playbook. Take credit, shift blame, look good on paper while your team did the real work. He sat in his office Tuesday morning, staring at an email from Elizabeth's assistant scheduling a one-on-one meeting for Thursday. His hands were sweating. He called 2 other managers who had run their departments the same way. They had meetings scheduled too. "This wasn't a coincidence. What do we do?" one of them asked over the phone. "Nothing," Daniel said, trying to sound confident. "We just keep our heads down. She can't fire everyone. That would be chaos." But Daniel didn't sound convinced, even to himself. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was moving forward with her plans. She met with Tom Chen on Tuesday afternoon. He came into her office nervous, having heard what happened to Richard, but not quite believing the changes could be real. "Tom, I watched you present your efficiency model in that team meeting," Elizabeth said. "It was innovative and well thought out. I also saw Mr. Thompson dismiss it, then present it as his own work 2 hours later." Tom's jaw tightened. "You saw that? I saw a lot of things. I want you to revive that project. You'll lead it directly with your own team and full credit. I've already allocated budget for it. This is your project, Tom, your name on it. Your success when it works." Tom sat back in his chair, overwhelmed. "I've been here 6 years. This is the first time anyone's asked me to lead anything. That changes now. I need people like you. People with real ideas and the courage to present them, even when they get shot down." Over the next few days, Elizabeth held meeting after meeting. She spoke with employees who had been invisible for years. She listened to their ideas, their frustrations, their hopes for what the department could become, and she began building her team, not based on politics or who knew who, but on actual talent and character. Linda threw herself into her new role with an energy she'd forgotten she had. Elizabeth had asked her to audit the past year's major projects, documenting who actually did the work versus who got credit. What Linda found was worse than she expected. projects that had won awards, presentations that led to promotions, efficiency gains that resulted in bonuses. In almost every case, the actual work had been done by junior staff or assistants, while managers took the credit and the rewards. This is going to upset a lot of people, Linda said during a meeting with Elizabeth on Wednesday. Good, Elizabeth replied. It should upset people. It's been upsetting the people who actually did the work for years. Now it's someone else's turn to be uncomfortable. By Thursday, 3 more managers had been placed on administrative leave. The pattern was clear. Elizabeth wasn't just targeting Richard. She was cleaning house. Anyone who had built their career on stolen credit and toxic management was facing investigation. Daniel Harper's meeting with Elizabeth that afternoon lasted 90 minutes. He walked out pale and shaken. By Friday morning, he had submitted his resignation. 2 other managers followed by Monday of the next week. But not everyone was facing consequences. Elizabeth also promoted 4 employees who had been stuck in junior positions despite excellent work. She restructured teams to remove barriers. She created a formal mentorship program. She established clear paths for advancement based on actual performance. The office buzzed with an energy it hadn't had in years. People started speaking up in meetings. Ideas flowed. Projects that had been stuck in bureaucracy suddenly started moving forward. Ashley Santos, the woman who had left the company 2 years earlier, received a phone call from Elizabeth personally. Mrs. Santos, you don't know me, but I'm the new COO at Silverstone. I've been reviewing historical records, and I found that you developed the efficiency system that won regional recognition. The recognition went to someone else. Ashley was silent for a moment. That's ancient history. I've moved on. I understand, but I want you to know that the record has been corrected internally. Your name is now properly attributed to that work. And if you're interested, I'd like to discuss bringing you back to the company at a significantly higher level than when you left. Ashley laughed, but it wasn't bitter. You're serious. Completely. You have talent that was wasted here. I'd like the chance to make that right. Let me think about it, Ashley said. But for the first time in years, she felt like maybe corporate environments weren't all toxic. Maybe some places were actually trying to change. 3 weeks into Elizabeth's tenure, the department was unrecognizable. Productivity was up 20%. 3 people who had been planning to quit had withdrawn their resignations. The employee satisfaction survey, which Elizabeth had administered immediately, showed dramatic improvement already. But the real test came during the first major presentation to the board of directors. It was a quarterly review, something Richard had always handled, taking credit for everyone's work and schmoozing the board members. This time, Elizabeth did things differently. Linda stood at the front of the boardroom, nervous but prepared. Behind her, Tom and 3 other team members sat ready to present their sections. Good morning, Linda began. I'm Linda Reeves, Operations Manager. I'll be presenting our quarterly results, and I've brought the team members who did the actual work so they can speak to their contributions directly. Several board members looked surprised. This wasn't how these presentations usually went. Linda walked through the numbers, which were strong. Then she introduced Tom, who explained his efficiency model in detail. Another team member discussed the logistics improvements. Each person presented their own work, answered questions, and received recognition. Elizabeth sat to the side, saying nothing. This wasn't her show. It belonged to the people who had actually done the work. When the presentation ended, the board chairman spoke. Ms. Reeves, that was exceptional. I have to say, this is the most detailed and honest quarterly review we've had from operations in years. Thank you, sir. I think you'll find that when people know they'll receive credit for their actual work, they're motivated to do their best work. After the meeting, Gregory pulled Elizabeth aside. I've been with this company 30 years. I've never seen a transformation happen this fast. It's not really a transformation, Elizabeth replied. These people were always talented. They were just being held back. All I did was remove the barriers and let them do what they've always been capable of. Whatever you did, keep doing it. The board is impressed. But not everyone was happy about the changes. That afternoon, Elizabeth received an email from Richard's lawyer. He was threatening to sue for wrongful termination, claiming the investigation was biased and that he was being made a scapegoat. Elizabeth called her legal team in HR. They reviewed the documentation together. The evidence was overwhelming. Emails showing Richard taking credit for others' work. Testimonies from 12 different employees. The audit trail showing projects he claimed to have managed that he barely participated in. Let him sue, Elizabeth said calmly. Everything was documented properly. He'll lose, and frankly, if it makes him feel better to try, that's his choice. The lawyer nodded. I'll draft a response. That evening, Elizabeth stayed late in her office reviewing plans for the next quarter. There was still so much to do, more managers to evaluate, systems to rebuild, a culture to transform completely. Linda knocked on her door around 7 o'clock. You're still here? Elizabeth smiled. I could say the same to you. I wanted to thank you, Linda said. Not just for the promotion, for believing that things could be different, for actually making them different. You did the hard part, Elizabeth replied. You stayed. You kept doing good work even when no one acknowledged it. You didn't become bitter or cynical. That takes real strength. Can I ask you something? Linda said. When Richard said those things to you at the restaurant, when he tried to humiliate you, did you know you'd be his boss? I knew I'd be someone's boss, Elizabeth said. I didn't know whose. But that incident did tell me something important. It told me how people in this organization treated others when they thought those others didn't matter. And it reminded me why this work is important. Because people deserve dignity. Because everyone deserves dignity, regardless of what they're wearing, what their job title is, or how much money they make. The moment you start thinking some people matter more than others, you've lost your way. And too many organizations lose their way because they let people like Richard set the culture. Linda nodded slowly. We almost lost our way completely. But you didn't. And now you get to help build something better. After Linda left, Elizabeth stood at her office window, looking out at the city lights. She thought about Richard, probably at home, angry and bitter, blaming everyone but himself. She thought about all the Richards in the world, the people who climbed over others and called it success. But she also thought about the Lindas, the Toms, the Ashleys, the people who kept showing up doing good work, hoping someone would eventually notice. Those were the people worth fighting for. Her phone buzzed. A text from Tom. Thank you for today. I never thought I'd get to present my own work to the board. It means everything. Elizabeth smiled and replied simply, You earned it. The transformation wasn't complete. There would be more resistance, more challenges, more people who didn't want to change. But the foundation was being laid. A foundation built on respect, recognition, and the radical idea that people should be valued for what they actually contributed, not for how well they played political games. It had taken years for the toxic culture to take root. It would take time to fully heal. But Elizabeth had time. And more importantly, she had people like Linda and Tom who were ready to build something better. The simply dressed woman from the restaurant had proven that you don't need designer clothes to have power. You don't need to humiliate others to be respected. You just need to see people for who they really are, treat them with dignity, and give them the opportunity to show what they're capable of. Everything else follows from there.